Welcome to the 30-day novel NaNoWriMo series. Today is day 26. My name is Lynn Johnston and I blog at writesmarternotharder.com. As always, we're going to start by talking about how you are going to move your story forward today. Today marks the beginning of your story's climax. Your protagonist and his or her allies are going to begin their final attack on the antagonist forces. There's going to be some initial engagement with the antagonist forces on some level, even if that engagement is at the level of recognizing that they're there and avoiding them. So, looking at your protagonist, what is going to make your protagonist finally worthy of defeating the antagonist? What does he or she learn from everything that's happened before this that's earned him or her the right to victory? Your protagonist has been through a lot. You are heading into the final point, or a final major point on your protagonist's growth arc. And that's the point where your protagonist shows his or her true colors once and for all, and we see that he or she has changed or not changed as a result of all the turmoil that he or she has been through, and all the obstacles overcome, and all the personal interactions throughout this journey. So your protagonist is going to be worthy of defeating the antagonist in two ways. Physically, in the sense of having actually done what he or she needs to do to win at the climax, and mentally or emotionally in terms of having come far enough to separate from the backstory that's been shaping him or her for his or her entire life, being able to just say, okay, I am going to stop letting that backstory control me, those defining traumatic events. They are not my destiny, and I am going to do what I need to do regardless of the fact that I suffered in the past. Or it might be your protagonist finally overcoming his or her flaw. If your character's growth arc is moving from selfishness to selflessness, this might be the point where we really start to see how selfless your protagonist is able to be. And the small selfless acts that we see here will foreshadow the big selfless act that your protagonist makes at the climax, which may even be to the point of self-sacrifice to save someone else. Or if it's a wound that your protagonist has been unable to heal, we might see that wound starting to heal here. We might see the protagonist still wrestling with the wound. Maybe the wound doesn't start healing until the protagonist wins at the climax. It just depends on what kind of arc you've got. But basically, whatever it is that your protagonist is dealing with in their growth arc, that is what makes them worthy of defeating the antagonist on an emotional or mental or spiritual level, depending on what kind of story you're writing. So think about that, and think about how you can set that up now. You're going to have this moment in your climax on day 29 where your protagonist embodies the transformation they've been trying to make this whole time, and they will make a choice and take an action that demonstrates very clearly to the reader that they have changed in some way. See if you know what that change is going to have to be, and what that decision is going to have to be, and what action they will take to demonstrate that they've been transformed. See if today you can figure out how to set that up. Maybe it's all intuitive, or maybe you already know. Maybe you don't have to think about that. For me, often I have to pay attention to that as I'm writing the climax of the story, because I will get so caught up in the action and the external events that I will forget to make that clear. And then when I go back and edit, I have to do a lot of revising of my climax to bring out the character's emotional journey during this part of the story. And so thinking about it in advance helps bring it out so that it's there on the page when you're writing it. Looking at your other characters, what part of your protagonist's ally is going to play in this final confrontation? Are some of them starting to fall off as they start interacting with the antagonist forces today? Do you lose a scout? Does one of your spies not come back? Does the contagonist get captured? Does the protagonist get wounded as he's like trying to do something and encounters one of the antagonist minions? Wounded in a way that's going to affect, of course, the climax of the story. Does your protagonist suffer at all today as a result of anything happening to his or her allies? Is this a point where one of your protagonist's allies is going to show their true colors and defect to the other side or betray the protagonist in some way? Also, you want to look at what your antagonist minions and henchmen are doing today. How are they interacting with the protagonist forces? Are they starting to go on the offensive? Are they standing guard? Is this the day where your protagonist is sneaking through a marsh and they're just trying to avoid the antagonist patrols? Or maybe is the antagonist minions actively coming after them? Maybe they're running today. The antagonist has figured out that they were about to attack the castle and sent a bunch of soldiers out to the place in the forest where they were camping, and they have to fight and flee and move to another place and regroup so they can attack the castle. Also, what are your secondary characters on each side standing to gain or lose? It's like, we know yesterday you should have set up the protagonist stakes. Today is a good day to emphasize what everybody else loses. Is the protagonist the only one who can free an entire kingdom from an evil wizard? If that's the case, a whole lot of his or her allies are depending on him to succeed and have a lot to lose if he fails. Also, your antagonist henchmen are going to lose something too. Right now, they are probably in a position of power. They think they're on the winning side, and that's where they probably want to be. So they have some stakes too, and they're going to probably fight a little bit harder if they see their livelihood and their way of life being threatened. So looking at how your protagonist allies and your antagonist allies are interacting, some of that could come out today in their interactions from what they say to each other, or how they interact. Each of them interacts with people on their side. So setting up secondary stakes for secondary characters kind of adds some tension to the climax of your story, just because you're reminding the reader, hey, not only does the protagonist and the antagonist stand to win and lose things, but also everybody else around them is standing to win and lose things too. And if your reader cares about the protagonist's sidekicks or allies, or some of the other secondary characters that are maybe have gotten caught up in this, like maybe an innocent village that they've gotten to know over the course of the story is going to be wiped out if the protagonist loses. It's another way to get your reader to invest more emotionally in the climax of the story. And of course, not only are the secondary characters a good source of emotional engagement, they're also a great way to generate conflict. We talked about the possibility that one of the protagonist's allies could be a traitor, but also they could just simply fail. The protagonist's allies could let him or her down by just not being able to get the information they needed, or not being able to get enough recruits, or losing a fight and dying and depriving the protagonist of their help and their advice. So think about how all of your secondary characters can add to the conflict today. And again, it's hard because you're trying to balance this. You want to be escalating from here up until the climax. So you can't have like a massively intense battle happening today, because if today is the most intense battle in the book, that sucks a lot of the energy out of your climax. So walking that fine line of building conflict and building tension and building intensity, but not hitting 10. You don't want to hit 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 just yet. So thinking more about little conflicts, personal losses. We've already talked about the stakes for the protagonist and the antagonist, and the stakes for secondary characters. People are going to start experiencing losses here as the two sides engage and start fighting. they're probably going to make some sacrifices. Maybe the good guys are going to take on some burdens. Maybe the evil village that's in the way, maybe some of the protagonist forces are going to stay and protect the village, even though it means they have a less chance of success in storming the castle. And also ask yourself what surprises the antagonist might have up his or her sleeve. Even though the antagonist might have been off screen for a while, we might not have been following what he's doing or she's doing. But you, I keep reminding you as the author, you have to know what she's doing at every point of the story, even when your characters are off screen. So whatever the antagonist has been working on while we've been focusing on the protagonist preparation and the protagonist dark moment, this is where we start seeing the fruits of your antagonist effort. The surprises that he or she has up his sleeve, the traps that have been prepared, the intel that he or she has managed to keep secret so that the protagonist is going to be surprised today or tomorrow. And of course, looking at your setting, how are the protagonist forces and antagonist forces each going to try and use setting elements to their advantage? The setting needs to affect how the battle takes place. And in some ways, it can be very obvious, like if you're trudging through a marsh trying to avoid the enemy patrols that are trying to guard the marsh is going to make it tough going, right? You could lose people to the alligators hanging out in the marsh. You could lose people because they fall into a sinkhole. You're probably having a hard time moving quietly if you're like splashing through like knee deep water or getting, walking through mud, and mud makes that sucking noise. So there's a whole bunch of little ways that you can increase conflict if you think about your setting and how your setting is making it harder for the protagonist, how it's shaping that confrontation. If your protagonist and antagonist forces are meeting in a canyon today, that drastically affects how they're going to fight. It's like they can only go forward and backward. One of them is going to be trapped at the end of the canyon unless they want to climb out. If your protagonist and antagonist are meeting at a cheerleading competition, what the other people around them are doing, the rules of the competition is going to affect their behavior. If one of them is, let's say your antagonist has sabotaged your protagonist just found out about it, and now her pom-poms are ruined and her outfit is trashed, and she doesn't have anything reasonable to wear during her routine. Her like theme costume is ruined, and now she's got to improvise something. There will be some things available in the setting to help her do that. Maybe she could borrow a leotard from one person and get some, I don't know, a scarf from someone else that she can use kind of as a sash or as a prop in her routine. So there's going to be things that will be available to her, but there will also be other things that won't. Like, for example, the rules are going to put a time constraint on her. She's going to have to be in certain places at a certain time in order to not forfeit. Maybe there's a rule that says she can't leave, or maybe it's just that her mom dropped her off there and she doesn't have any way to get to a store to buy the thing that she needs, and she's going to have to go without it. So, I mean, it doesn't matter what kind of battle your characters are having. Look to your setting. There's going to be something there. If you've picked a good setting that's appropriate for this kind of battle, there's going to be something in it that you can use to make things harder for the protagonist, and also that your protagonist can use to their advantage. Looking at your story promise. This is the time for you to start looking at all the promises you have made through the last 24 days or 25 days, and start asking yourself, have I fulfilled them all? Am I fulfilling them all? If you promise the reader that this is going to be a story of redemption and your character has not been redeemed yet, you better start thinking about how they're going to get redeemed in the climax. And you better focus on that moment of redemption and how you're going to set it up and what's going to trigger it. If you've promised the reader that there's going to be some sort of massive military clash like in the Lord of the Rings movie with like huge armies facing off on the battlefield, if your protagonist is not heading for a battlefield, you're in trouble. And chances are you've already fulfilled a lot of the promises, because we tend to have a unified vision for the story. We tend to kind of know what kind of story we're trying to tell. But this is the point where if there's something that you have promised that you've not fulfilled, for example, if you had a subplot that was about your protagonist fighting with her mom and she hasn't made peace with her mom yet, unless the mom is the villain that she's making peace with during the climax, today and tomorrow are the days where you want to figure out how she can make progress on that and how she can resolve that. Ultimately, unless you're writing a series with an overarching story goal, for example, like maybe each book the protagonist is fighting a lower level boss and they're working their way up to a final confrontation with a big boss in a final book. Unless you have that kind of book, chances are you're going to need to tie up every loose end that you started at the beginning of the story. Giving the reader a sense of resolution is a big part of having them close the book and want to buy the next one. And of course, it is possible to not resolve everything. If you're writing a series, there are things you won't want to resolve. If your character's growth arc unfolds over a series of 12 books that you have planned, you can't tie that up completely. You need to tie up a small part of it, though, to give the reader a sense of resolution, like, okay, this story is complete. Even though I have to wait a year to read the next installment, I feel satisfied that this was a good story. So, if you haven't done this and you have a story with a lot of plot threads in it, if you have like more than one subplot, for example, or you have multiple characters moving through your story, maybe you have a group that makes up the protagonist, I recommend actually making a list. Just make a quick list of each story thread that you've set up, and then looking at every single story thread and asking yourself, have I tied this up in a satisfying way, or do I need to tie this up in a satisfying way? And sometimes giving the reader resolution is just a matter of hinting that things are going to be better from here on out. You don't always have to show every character's moment of epiphany, especially the secondary characters. Often you don't want to, but you do want the reader to feel like, okay, the questions that got raised at the beginning of the story got answered in a satisfying way. Getting started, please always do your pre-writing ritual and your pre-writing exercises. Do whatever you have to do to get into your story. And thinking about your secondary characters, and I mean today's significant secondary characters, not every single secondary character in the book, but for example, the allies that have been closest to your protagonist. Give each one of them a little significant moment or a special moment during this final confrontation. It can be a small victory or a noble death. And here's why I'm recommending this. If you have, for example, your character is a prince and he's got like 4 knights that went everywhere with him and helped him out throughout this entire story. Some of your characters are going to have gotten attached to those 4 knights. Some of your readers have gotten attached to those 4 knights. Some of your readers will have gotten so attached to those 4 knights for whatever reason that they kind of feel like those secondary characters, that one that they identify with so much, maybe because he's like them or because he represents something that they really love. Your reader is going to be excited to see any secondary character that they've gotten really invested in having some sort of a special moment. So this is basically a way to get greater reader engagement. Readers who maybe didn't completely identify with your protagonist, but identified with one of his or her allies, or one of the secondary characters in the book. This gives those readers a payoff. It gets them more excited about the climax because they're seeing someone special to them, having something meaningful happen to them. And also, you're building up to this main conflict between protagonist and antagonist. And if everything you write for the next several days is just about your protagonist and your antagonist fighting, it's going to feel kind of like you've got this long, drawn-out conflict. And maybe it really is that hard. Maybe you've made that conflict that big. But focusing on some of these secondary conflicts that you've already set up in the story and giving them their time actually is a way of delaying the big confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonist and creating more suspense. It's just like in a movie when they have two storylines going and they stop one at a cliffhanger and then they move to the second storyline. You're like, ah, right? It raises your suspense, and the whole time you're watching the second storyline, you still got those elevated tension levels from the first storyline, because you're still wondering what the heck happened after that cliffhanger. So it serves multiple purposes in your story to give some of these more significant secondary characters a bigger part in the climax. And it's really tempting to just focus on your protagonist and just have it be all about your protagonist. And I don't know what your story is, so it may be that that's appropriate. But if your protagonist has a group that has been helping him or is part of a group, you want to think about how they can have their own like little teeny mini climaxes during this build up to the main climax of the story. After you write, please always celebrate your progress and prepare for tomorrow. Do whatever you need to do today to make tomorrow easier. You're almost done. You're coming up to the finish line. So do everything you can to make success possible. Thank you for hanging out with me today. I look forward to talking with you tomorrow, and happy writing.